November 1967. Tan Son Hut Air Base, Saigon. General William Westmoreland sits across from ACBS correspondent, confident, steady. The cameras roll. He delivers the numbers like a stockbroker reading quarterly earnings. "We are winning a war of attrition," he says. "The enemy's losses are at an all-time high. 42,000 enemy dead that year. 5,000 the month before. The mathematics are irrefutable. By every measurable standard body counts, territory secured. Weapons captured. The United States military is winning." 3 months later, 80,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers attack more than 100 cities simultaneously across South Vietnam. Westmoreland's arithmetic was correct. His conclusion was not. This is the story of how a superpower learned to count everything that mattered least, and how victory became a word without meaning. The machine North American war machine in Vietnam was a demonstration of industrial power applied to human conflict. By 1968, 500,000 U.S. troops occupied a country the size of New Mexico. They possessed orbital surveillance, tactical air superiority, artillery that could level grid squares in minutes, and logistical networks that moved more tonnage daily than most nations produced in a year. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Find the enemy, fix them in place, destroy them with firepower. Repeat until their capacity to resist collapses. Search and destroy. The doctrine assumed that war was fundamentally a math problem, that insurgencies could be solved through subtraction, that there existed some calculable threshold, some number of enemy dead, beyond which continuation became impossible. General Westmoreland requested this threshold be identified. MACV analysts worked the problem. They estimated North Vietnamese infiltration rates, birth rates, morale factors, economic capacity. They built models. The crossover point, they determined, would arrive when monthly enemy losses exceeded replacement capacity by a sustainable margin. By late 1967, intelligence suggested they had reached it. The enemy, according to the data, was on the verge of collapse. The models were technically sophisticated. The analysts were competent. The mathematics checked. What the models couldn't account for was the Patrol March 1966. Binh Dinh Province. A Marine rifle company moves through elephant grass in the Central Highlands. They have been searching for 3 days. They have found nothing. The operation is called Marion. It will last 6 months. For battalions, 3,000 men sweeping an area the size of Rhode Island. Their mission, locate and destroy the 18th NVA Regiment. Day after day, the columns move, platoons establish night positions. Listening posts push out into the darkness. Ambushes are set along suspected trails. Most nights, nothing happens. The Marines patrol in humidity that turns uniforms into second skins. They cross rice paddies where each step might trigger a mine. They enter villages where old men smile and children wave, and no one knows anything about enemy movements. On the 47th day, a point man trips a wire. The explosion tears through second squad. Before the ringing in their ears subsides, automatic weapons open up from the tree line. The firefight lasts 11 minutes. 2 Marines dead, 7 wounded. When the smoke clears, they find 3 blood trails leading into the jungle and to enemy bodies. The company calls in artillery. Helicopter gunships strafe the tree line. Fighter bombers drop napalm on the suspected withdrawal route. The jungle burns. Smoke rises in thick columns visible. For miles. At headquarters, the operation is logged as a successful contact. Enemy losses to confirmed, 3 probable. American losses to killed, 7 wounded. The calculus looks favorable. What doesn't appear in the report? The 18th NVA Regiment remains intact, operational, and now occupies terrain 12 kilometers west. The Marines will not find them again for another 19 days. This pattern search, contact, destroy, redeploy repeats across the country. Units measure success in enemy killed. Command measures success in operations conducted. The statistics flow upward. Progress is reported, but the map never changes color. the village-ine conventional warfare. Territory is the objective. You seize ground, hold it, deny it to the enemy. The map changes color. Progress is visible. Vietnam inverted this logic. The Marines understood it first. In 1965, they initiated combined action platoons, small units embedded in villages, living among the population, focused on security rather than sweeping operations. A CAP squad typically consisted of 13 Marines and a Navy corpsman paired with a local popular forces platoon. They built relationships, learned names, sat in village meetings, taught basic tactics to local militia, created networks of trust that made insurgent infiltration difficult. It worked. Villages under CAP protection saw dramatic reductions in Viet Cong activity. Tax collection stopped, assassinations declined. Farmers reported enemy movements. MACV command watched this approach with suspicion. The problem, from Westmoreland's perspective, was that CAP didn't produce quantifiable results. It consumed manpower without generating body counts. It was defensive, passive, and it required a specific kind of soldier, one willing to live in a village for months, learn basic Vietnamese, operate with minimal support. And it couldn't scale. There were 12,500 villages in South Vietnam. The Marines had enough personnel for perhaps 200 combined action platoons. Even if the entire Marine Corps committed to the concept, they couldn't cover a fraction of the countryside. Westmoreland's alternative: establish secure areas through aggressive patrolling and overwhelming firepower, then turn security over to ARVN forces. American units would remain mobile, hunting main force enemy units. This approach used American strengths, mobility, firepower, logistics rather than requiring cultural adaptation and long-term presence. The first approach required decades and a different kind of war. The second approach required helicopters and artillery. The institutional preference was clear. By 1967, CAP remained a niche program. The bulk of American forces continued search and destroy operations. They swept through villages, engaged the enemy when they found them, called in firepower, and moved on. They won nearly every firefight. They never secured the countryside. The Count September 1967, the 3rd Corps Tactical Zone. After a contact near the Cambodian border, a rifle platoon moves through the kill zone at first light. They find 16 bodies. The lieutenant radios the count to company. Company reports it to battalion. Battalion logs it in the daily operational summary that goes to MACV headquarters. 16 enemy Kia. 2 days later, intelligence receives a report from an ARVN ranger. The unit they engaged was a local force company, approximately 60 men. The after-action sweep missed a secondary withdrawal route. Enemy casualties were likely 4 or 5. The rest escaped. The correction never makes it into the record. At MACV, the number remains 16 enemy Kia. This wasn't malice, it was structure. Commanders were evaluated on metrics. Body count was the primary metric. Units that produced high body counts received recognition, supplies, support. Units that didn't were questioned about their aggressiveness, their willingness to close with the enemy. The incentive system rewarded killing. It did not reward accuracy. By 1967, body count inflation had become systematic. In some units, any military-age male found dead in an operational area was classified as enemy Kia. Weapons caches discovered miles from any contact were used to justify inflated casualty estimates. Civilian casualties sometimes entered the count. Westmoreland knew the numbers were soft. He complained about it in private communications. He sent directives demanding accuracy. He established verification procedures. But he also used the numbers to demonstrate progress to Washington. Because without the numbers, what could he show? The enemy controlled no cities. They held no territory. They possessed no infrastructure visible to orbital reconnaissance. The war existed in villages and jungles and the space between patrols. Body count was the only metric that made the invisible war visible. So the metrics became the mission, and the mission was producing metrics. That suggested the war was being won. In Washington, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara reviewed the data. He saw an enemy taking unsustainable casualties. He saw American forces dominating every engagement. He saw the crossover point approaching. He believed the numbers because the alternative was admitting the war had no measurable path to victory. The Bordethe-Ho-Chi-Minh Trail was not a trail. It was a logistical network of roads, paths, way stations, and storage facilities stretching from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia into South Vietnam. At its peak, it moved 10,000 tons of supplies per month. The United States dropped more ordnance on this network than it had dropped in all of World War II. The trail kept functioning. Bombing created detours. The detours were cleared within days. Destroyed bridges were replaced with underwater spans that appeared as shadows on aerial reconnaissance. Damaged roads were bypassed through jungle paths cut by laborers who worked at night and hid during the day. Intelligence estimated that interdiction efforts destroyed perhaps 20% of supplies. Moving south. The North simply increased what they sent. They accepted losses. They adapted. They built redundancy into every segment of the network. When American sensors detected movement along one route, traffic shifted to another. When B-52s cratered a road junction, supplies flowed around. The damage. The trail was never a single thing that could be cut. It was a system, adaptive, distributed, resilient. By 1968, it had become a permanent reality. It could be harassed, disrupted, slowed but not closed. And it meant that Hanoi retained the ability to determine the pace and intensity of the war. American forces could win every engagement. They could kill at extraordinary ratios. They could seize and hold any terrain they chose. But they could not cut the enemy's supply line. This was the strategic reality that no amount of tactical success could overcome. Westmoreland understood the problem. He requested permission to launch ground operations into Laos and Cambodia to sever the trail at its source. Permission was denied. The war was contained within South Vietnam's borders for political reasons that made strategic sense in Washington and tactical nonsense in the field. So American forces fought an enemy who could retreat across borders they could not cross, who received supplies through routes they could not permanently interdict, who controlled the tempo of engagement because they decided when and where to fight. The war, at the strategic level, was unwinnable under these constraints. At the tactical level, it looked like victory every day. The Wire, January 21, 1968. San Combat Base. The base sits on a plateau near the Laotian border, surrounded by mountains. 6,000 Marines occupy a position that intelligence reports is now encircled by 20,000 NVA troops. Westmoreland sees an opportunity. Giap, the North Vietnamese commander who defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu, appears to be attempting the same strategy, a set-piece siege, a decisive battle. This is the kind of fight the American military was designed to win. Westmoreland positions assets. B-52s are placed on standby. Artillery firebases are established on surrounding hilltops. Supply routes are reinforced. Every available sensor is focused on the Khe Sanh area. If the NVA want Khe Sanh, they will have to come through a curtain of steel. The siege begins for 77 days. The NVA shell the base. They probe the wire. They attack outlying positions. They dig trenches that creep closer each night under cover of fog and darkness. American firepower responds with apocalyptic intensity. On some days, tactical aircraft drop 1,000 tons of ordnance on the surrounding area. Artillery fires around the clock. B-52s conduct arc-light strikes on suspected troop concentrations, each mission dropping 108 500-pound bombs. The noise becomes a constant. The ground trembles. Sleep happens in fragments. Intelligence estimates NVA casualties in the thousands, possibly tens of thousands. The base holds. In April, the siege lifts. The NVA withdraw into Laos. Khe Sanh is declared a victory. Westmoreland compares it to Gettysburg. 3 months later, the base is abandoned. It had never been strategically necessary. Its value was symbolic, a firebase near the border, a statement of American presence. When that symbolism became a liability, The base was dismantled. Years afterward, former NVA officers would acknowledge that Khe-Sanh was a diversion, a way to pull American attention and resources toward the border, while preparations were finalized elsewhere. The trenches, the shelling, the probes against the wire, all of it designed to fix American forces in place and consume there. Focus. The real objective was never the base. It was what the Americans would do to defend it. While Westmoreland's attention was locked on Khe-Sanh, 80,000 enemy troops were infiltrating into cities across South Vietnam. The offensive of January 30, 1968, 0300 hours across South Vietnam. The cities are quiet. It is Tet, the Lunar New Year. A ceasefire has been declared. Half of ARVN forces are on leave. At the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, two military police guards stand watch at the compound gate. The street outside is empty. A few motorbikes pass. Normal traffic for the hour. A taxi and a truck approach slowly through the pre-dawn darkness. At 20 meters, automatic weapons fire tears through the vehicle's windows. The MPs fall. 19 Viet Cong sappers rush the gate with satchel charges. The first explosion blows a hole in the wall. Within minutes, the most secure American facility in Vietnam is underground assault. The sappers fight through the compound. Marine guards respond from the Chancery building. Helicopter gunships arrive overhead. The battle is close quarters, room to dash room. 6 hours later, all 19 attackers are dead. The embassy is secured. But in that same window, 80,000 NVA and Viet Cong troops have attacked more than 100 cities, towns, and military installations across South Vietnam. The Tet offensive. From a purely military standpoint, Tet was a catastrophic failure for Hanoi. The general uprising they hoped to trigger never materialized. The South Vietnamese population did not rise against the Saigon government. ARVN forces, written off by American intelligence as corrupt and ineffective, fought with unexpected tenacity. In Hue, Marines and ARVN units fought house to house for 26 days to retake the city from NVA regulars in Saigon. Elite Ranger battalions cleared VC units from the streets in brutal close-quarters combat. U.S. firepower responded with devastating efficiency. Within weeks, the offensive collapsed. Within months, the Viet Cong infrastructure in the south was shattered, units destroyed, cadres killed, networks rolled up. Enemy casualties exceeded 45,000. American casualties, 1,100 killed. ARVN casualties, 2,300 killed. By every tactical measure, it was an overwhelming American victory. Walter Cronkite returned from Vietnam and told the American public that the war was unwinnable. Public support for the war collapsed. Westmoreland's request for 206,000 additional troops was denied. President Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. Hanoi had lost the battle. They won the war's political center of gravity. The gap disconnect between tactical success and strategic failure reveals a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of the conflict. Westmoreland fought the war he knew how to fight. He applied American strengths, mobility, firepower, logistics to find and destroy enemy forces. He measured progress through quantifiable metrics. He sought decisive engagement. This approach worked in World War II. It worked in Korea once. The front stabilized. It had worked in every major conflict the U.S. military had fought since 1945. It didn't work in Vietnam. Not because American forces weren't effective. They were extraordinarily effective. Not because the strategy was illogical. Within its assumptions, it made perfect sense. It didn't work because the enemy wasn't fighting the same war. The North Vietnamese understood something the American command structure couldn't process. The war's victory conditions were not symmetrical. The United States needed to achieve a stable, non-communist South Vietnam. This required destroying enemy main force units, cutting infiltration routes, building ARVN capability, establishing security across the countryside, and creating a legitimate government in Saigon. All of these simultaneously and sustainably. The North needed only to survive long enough for American political will to collapse. One side had to win every dimension, the other only had to not lose. Westmoreland's metrics, body counts, operational tempo, enemy bases destroyed measured performance. They didn't measure position. And the position was this: the United States was fighting a limited war with unlimited means, against an enemy fighting an unlimited war with limited means. Those are not equivalent problems. The Americans could kill 10 enemy soldiers for everyone they lost and still be losing, because the enemy's threshold for acceptable casualties was determined not by military logic, but by political will. And their will, forged in decades of resistance against the French and centuries of resistance against Chinese occupation, was effectively infinite within the time frame of American political patience. The Hamlet, April 1969. Quang in Gai Province. A platoon arrives at a hamlet that intelligence reports as Viet Cong controlled. They find women, children, elderly men, no weapons, no military-age males. The platoon leader knows the pattern. The men are either VC or hiding because they assume the Americans are going to assume. Their VC. He questions the village chief through an interpreter. The chief says the men are working in the fields. The fields are empty. The platoon searches the hamlet. They find rice caches buried in false bottom compartments, tunnels connecting houses beneath the village, a few rusted weapons wrapped in plastic and hidden in a well. They confiscate the rice, destroy the tunnels with explosives, call in coordinates for the weapons cache. Before they leave, the lieutenant tries to explain through the interpreter that the village needs to cooperate with the government, that American forces are there to help, that the VC will bring only destruction. The village chief nods politely. The platoon moves on to the next hamlet on their patrol route. 2 weeks later, intelligence reports the hamlet is back under VC control. This pattern repeats across thousands of hamlets. Clear. Hold. Build. Except the holding requires permanent presence and the building requires security. That can't be guaranteed once American forces move to the next operational area. So it becomes clear, leave. Return months later and clear again. The same villages, the same tunnels, the same caches, different soldiers, same mission, same result. The problem is one of ratios. The United States has 500,000 troops in country. South Vietnam has 12,500 villages. Even if every American soldier was dedicated to village security and most are in combat units conducting mobile operations, the numbers don't work. The VC need only a handful of cadres to control a village through persuasion or intimidation. They live there. They know everyone. They can identify collaborators and punish cooperation with the government. American patrols pass through. They spend hours, maybe a day. Then they're gone. The VC are there every night. This is the war that matters, the slow-motion struggle for control of the population. And it's the war the United States is structurally incapable of winning. With search and destroy tactics, the Marines understood this. Their CAT program worked at the village level, but it required resources and time that the war's political timeline wouldn't allow. So the patrols continued. The operations were logged. The hamlets were cleared and cleared again, and control remained with whoever could maintain permanent presence. The enemy captured NVA documents, translated by intelligence officers, reveal an enemy that understood its own weaknesses with brutal clarity. A 1967 after-action report from a regiment operating in the Central Highlands, American firepower, is overwhelming. We cannot win stand-up engagements. We must attack only when we achieve surprise and local superiority. We must break contact before artillery and air support arrive. We accept casualties of 3-1 if the engagement achieves political or psychological objectives. They knew they were losing the tactical fight. They continued fighting. Another document. This one a directive from COSVN Central Office for South Vietnam to cadres in 1968. The Americans count bodies. We count the will to continue. Every day. They do not achieve decisive victory. We are winning. Every month their public support declines. We are advancing. Time is our weapon. Patience is our strategy. American intelligence read these documents. They filed them. The operational approach did not change. because changing it would require admitting that the entire strategic framework attrition, crossover points, quantifiable progress was based on assumptions the enemy did not share. It would require fighting a different war. The institutional momentum was too great. The investment was too deep. The metrics showed progress, and so the war continued as it had been fought. American forces seeking decisive engagement, enemy forces avoiding it except when tactical conditions favored them, both sides accumulating. Casualties, one side measuring them against replacement capacity, the other measuring them against political will. In 1969, a CIA analyst named Samuel Adams discovered that MACV intelligence had been systematically undercounting enemy strength. The actual number of enemy forces was nearly double the official estimates. This meant the attrition strategy had been based on false premises from the beginning. The military's response was to question Adams' methodology, because accepting his analysis meant accepting that progress reports to Washington had been fundamentally wrong, that the crossover point was a fiction, that the light at the end of the tunnel was not approaching. Adams was sidelined. The estimates were not revised. The war continued. The General Creighton Abrams replaced Westmoreland in June 1968. He was a different kind of commander. Where Westmoreland was confident, articulate, political, Abrams was blunt, tactical, skeptical. He commanded armor in World War II. He understood maneuver warfare and the importance of local knowledge. He walked into a situation that was strategically untenable. American public support had collapsed. Troop withdrawals were inevitable. The South Vietnamese government remained corrupt and illegitimate in the eyes of much of its population. ARVN forces were improving but still dependent on American logistics and firepower. Abrams couldn't change the strategic picture, but he could change how the war was fought. He reduced emphasis on large unit sweeps, increased small unit patrolling, prioritized intelligence-driven operations targeting enemy infrastructure supply caches, command nodes, local force units. He called it one war, a recognition that military operations, pacification, and political development were interconnected, not separate lines of effort. The tactics improved. Body count, while still measured, was de-emphasized. The focus shifted to disrupting enemy operations, denying them resources, making their presence in the villages costly. American units began operating more like the enemy small patrols. Night ambushes, intelligence-driven raids. They learned to fight the war that existed rather than the war they'd trained for. It worked tactically. ARVN forces improved under Abrams' leadership. They took on more responsibility. They fought with greater competence. But the strategy remained unchanged because the strategy was set in Washington. And Washington's objective a stable, independent, non-communist South Vietnam required either a level of commitment the American public would no longer support or a South Vietnamese government, and military capable of sustaining itself. Neither existed. Abrams understood this. In his private assessments, he was clear-eyed. We cannot win this war through military means alone. We can create conditions for success. We cannot create success itself. By 1970, American troop withdrawals had begun. By 1972, only 25,000 American troops remained in Vietnam. The war would continue for 3 more years. The threshold. There is a moment in every long war when the question shifts from can we win to what are we willing to pay. For the United States in Vietnam, that moment arrived slowly, then all at once. It began with images, the embassy under assault, the execution of a Viet Cong prisoner in the streets of Saigon, captured on film, broadcast on evening news, the city of hue and ruins after being liberated. It continued with casualty reports, the weekly tallies, the names read on television, the body bags arriving at Dover Air Force Base. It accelerated with doubt, Cronkite's declaration, the protests, the realization that progress, if it existed at all, was measured in increments so small as to be invisible, and it crystallized with a simple question: if we're winning, why does it look like this? The military had answers. Tet was a tactical victory. Enemy casualties were unsustainable. ARVN forces were improving. Progress was being made. All of these things were true. None of them mattered, because the American public had been told for years that victory was approaching, that the crossover point was near, that the enemy was on the verge of collapse, and then 80,000 enemy troops attacked simultaneously across the country. The gap between the official narrative and visible reality became unbridgeable. This is the threshold every democracy faces in long wars, the point where the political cost of continuation exceeds the perceived strategic value of the objective. For Vietnam, that threshold was crossed in 1968. The war continued for 7 more years because institutions have momentum and withdrawals require planning, and South Vietnamese allies needed to be prepared, and political solutions needed to be negotiated. But the outcome was decided the moment the American public stopped believing victory was worth the price. The numbers between 1965 and 1973. The United States dropped 7.5 million tons of ordnance on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, 3 times the tonnage dropped in World War II. American forces conducted more than 1 million helicopter sorties. Artillery fired 26 million rounds. The military built 145 bases, dozens of airfields, hundreds of miles of roads. Economic aid to South Vietnam totaled billions annually. Enemy casualties. By American estimates, 950,000. American casualties, 58,000 dead, 300,000 wounded. ARVN casualties, 250,000 dead. Civilian casualties, estimates range from 600,000 to 2 million. The direct financial cost, $168 billion, equivalent to over $1 trillion today. In April 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. The war ended. The South Vietnamese government ceased to exist. By every measure the United States military applied during the conflict, victory had been inevitable. The enemy had taken unsustainable casualties. They had lost every major engagement. They controlled no cities, possessed no air force, commanded no naval assets. They won anyway. Asterisk, the autopsy military institutions are learning organizations. After Vietnam, the U.S. military conducted extensive analysis of what went wrong. Some conclusions were tactical, better small unit training, improved counterinsurgency doctrine, enhanced language and cultural preparation. Some were operational, more effective coordination between military and civilian agencies, better intelligence integration, refined targeting methodologies. Some were strategic, clearer definition of objectives, more realistic assessment of enemy capabilities and will. Honest reporting of progress. All of these lessons were valid. None addressed the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem was that the war was fought to achieve a political objective, a stable, non-communist South Vietnam that military force alone could not produce. This required a South Vietnamese government with legitimacy, and a South Vietnamese military capable of providing security without permanent American support. Neither existed. When American troops arrived in 1965, neither existed when they left in 1973. The intervening years of combat, the 58,000 American dead, the billions in aid, the tactical innovations, none of it created the political foundation necessary for South Vietnamese survival. Because you cannot kill your way to legitimacy, you cannot bomb a government into competence, you cannot create will through firepower. These are political problems. They require political solutions. Military force can create space for those solutions to develop. It cannot create the solutions themselves. This is the lesson Vietnam taught. It is also the lesson that proved hardest to learn. The Ecoin 2001. American forces entered Afghanistan. The mission: destroy Al-Qaeda, remove the Taliban, establish a stable government. 20 years later, the war ended with Taliban forces retaking Kabul as American forces withdrew. In the years between, American military performance was exceptional. Tactical victories were routine. Enemy casualties were disproportionate. Technology evolved. Doctrine adapted. Small unit tactics incorporated lessons from Vietnam and Iraq. Special operations forces became extraordinarily effective at finding and killing enemy leadership. Intelligence-driven night raids eliminated thousands of Taliban commanders. Surveillance assets tracked enemy movements with unprecedented precision. Body counts were no longer emphasized publicly, but they were still measured. And by that measure, the coalition was winning overwhelmingly. None of it mattered. The Afghan government lacked legitimacy. The Afghan military, despite billions in training and equipment, collapsed in weeks. The political foundation never existed. Military force created space for it to develop. It didn't develop. And so the war ended the way Vietnam ended, with American forces withdrawing and a government they supported ceasing to exist. The similarities are striking. The tactical differences: drones instead of bombers, smaller troop footprint. Different enemy obscured the strategic similarity. Both wars were fought to create political outcomes that military force could not produce. Both measured progress through metrics that didn't measure what mattered. Both lasted far longer than initial estimates suggested. Both ended with the realization that war cannot be destroyed through attrition. The question was end in two ways. One side loses the capacity to continue, or one side loses the will. Capacity can be destroyed. Factories can be bombed. Armies can be defeated. Resources can be exhausted. Will cannot. Will is a function of belief in the cause, in the likelihood of victory, in the acceptability of the cost. It exists in the space between what is lost and what might be gained. The United States possessed overwhelming capacity in Vietnam. It never lost a major battle. It never exhausted its resources. It could have continued fighting indefinitely. It lost the will. The North Vietnamese possessed limited capacity. They took casualties that would have broken most armies. They endured bombing that destroyed much of their infrastructure. They fought for decades. Their will never broke. This asymmetry, one side needing to win decisively, the other needing only to not lose, defines insurgent conflicts. The stronger power brings capacity. The weaker power brings will. If will outlasts capacity's patience, the weaker power wins. This is not a new insight. Mao wrote about it. The Viet Minh practiced it against the French. The Afghans used it against the Soviets. American military institutions studied all of these conflicts and then repeated the same pattern in Vietnam and Afghanistan. Not because the lessons were unknown, because the lessons required accepting that some conflicts cannot be won through military excellence, that some political objectives are not achievable through force, that capacity, no matter how overwhelming, has limits when applied to problems that are fundamentally political. These are uncomfortable truths for a military culture built on the assumption that properly applied force can solve any problem. Vietnam proved that assumption false. Afghanistan proved that the lesson hadn't been learned. The reckoning Vietnam War broke the American military's understanding of victory in ways that are still being processed. Victory, in traditional military terms, means compelling the enemy to accept your political objectives. This is achieved through destroying their capacity to resist, their armies defeated, their resources exhausted, their territory occupied. Vietnam inverted this. American forces were never defeated. They won virtually every engagement. They maintained air superiority, naval superiority, technological superiority throughout the war. They lost. This created a cognitive dissonance that the military spent decades trying to resolve. One response was to argue the military was never allowed to win that. Political constraints prevented the decisive application of force. This became known as the stabbed-in-the-back narrative. It's partially true. The war was fought under significant political constraints. No ground invasion of North Vietnam. No invasion of Laos or Cambodia until very late. Bombing halts for negotiations. But it misses the point. The constraints existed because the war was fought for limited political objectives, with unlimited means. The United States was never willing to risk a wider war with China or the Soviet Union. It was never willing to occupy North Vietnam permanently. It was never willing to sustain the war indefinitely. Regardless of political cost, These constraints defined the strategic space within which the war had to be won. Arguing that victory was achievable without constraints is arguing for a different war, with different risks and different objectives. The actual war, the one that was fought, was not winnable within the constraints that existed. This is not a failure of tactics or operations or military competence. It's a failure of strategy, of matching means to ends, of understanding the enemy's theory of victory, of recognizing when military force cannot achieve the desired political outcome. The silent sever is a moment in every documentary about Vietnam. When the archive footage goes quiet, the helicopters still fly, the soldiers still patrol, the bombs still fall, but the sound drops away. And in that silence, the question forms, what were we trying to accomplish? The answer depends on when you ask. In 1965, prevent communist expansion in Southeast Asia, honor commitments to allies, demonstrate American resolve. In 1968, achieve a negotiated settlement that preserves South Vietnamese independence. In 1973, withdraw with honor, maintain credibility. The objectives shifted as the war's strategic logic collapsed. What never changed was the conviction that victory was achievable if only the right tactics were employed, the right metrics measured, the right amount of force applied. This conviction persisted in the face of mounting evidence to the contrary. It persisted because the alternative, admitting the war was unwinnable within acceptable costs, was institutionally and politically unacceptable. So the war continued. Soldiers fought with courage and competence. They won their battles. They completed their missions. And the war continued to be unwinnable. This is the tragedy that statistics cannot capture. 58,000 Americans died fighting effectively in a war that could not be won. Not because they failed, because the objective required something military force could not provide. The lesson: modern military doctrine emphasizes effects-based operations. You don't measure success by sorties flown. You measure it by the effect those sorties produce on enemy capabilities and will. You don't count patrols. You assess whether the population feels secure. You don't track ordnance expended. You evaluate whether enemy freedom of movement has been restricted. These are harder things to measure. They are the only things that matter. Vietnam taught this lesson at extraordinary cost. The United States military entered the war with confidence born of industrial dominance and recent victory in World War II. It possessed overwhelming firepower, technological superiority, and logistical dominance. It lost the war, not in a single decisive battle, not through military defeat, but through the slow accumulation of tactical victories that never added up to strategic success. The metrics were real, the progress was measurable, the enemy casualties were verified. None of it moved toward the political objective the war was meant to achieve. This is the paradox that haunts every counterinsurgency. You can win every battle and still lose the war, because insurgencies are not defeated through attrition. They are defeated by separating them from the population, by creating governments with enough legitimacy to command loyalty, by building security forces capable of independent operation. These are political achievements. Military force can support them. It cannot create them. The Aftermath Vietnam War Memorial in Washington contains 58,320 names. Each name represents a person who died believing their mission mattered. Most of them died in tactical victories, firefights won, ambushes successfully executed, defensive positions held against superior numbers. American soldiers in Vietnam performed with extraordinary competence. Small unit leadership was exceptional, innovation was constant, courage was routine. They deserved to win. They did win, tactically, overwhelmingly, consistently, and the war was still lost. This is not a contradiction. It is the reality of wars fought for political objectives that military excellence cannot achieve. The soldiers who fought in Vietnam were not defeated. The strategy that sent them there was flawed from inception. It assumed that sufficient application of force would break enemy will. It assumed that body counts were a meaningful measure of progress. It assumed that the enemy would eventually recognized the futility of resistance. The enemy never shared these assumptions. They fought a different war with different victory conditions and a different understanding of what was acceptable to achieve those conditions. And in the end, their understanding prevailed. The inheritance every military professional educated after Vietnam has studied the war. The tactical lessons are clear. Better small unit training, improved cultural awareness, more effective integration of intelligence and operations. The operational lessons are documented, more realistic metrics, clearer command relationships, better coordination between military and civilian agencies. The strategic lessons are harder. They require accepting that military force has limits, that some problems cannot be solved through the application of more troops, better technology, or superior firepower. That wars fought for limited political objectives against enemies willing to accept unlimited costs are not winnable through traditional military means. That the willingness to continue fighting despite losses is not measurable, not predictable, and not destructible through attrition. These lessons challenge fundamental assumptions about what military power can achieve. They suggest that in some conflicts, the question is not how do we win, but can this be won at acceptable cost? Vietnam answered the question with 58,000 American lives. Afghanistan repeated the same calculation 2 decades later. The lesson remains incompletely learned. The mirror in the final analysis. Vietnam broke the meaning of victory by revealing that military success and strategic success are not the same thing. Victory, in traditional terms, meant compelling the enemy to accept your political will through the destruction of their capacity to resist. This definition assumed symmetrical warfare between nation-states with measurable industrial capacity and definable military forces. Vietnam didn't fit the model. The enemy's capacity to resist was not located in factories that could be bombed or armies that could be destroyed. It was distributed across a population, sustained by external powers beyond reach, and measured in political will rather than industrial output. American forces did win every tactical engagement, but tactical victories didn't accumulate into operational success, and operational success didn't translate into strategic victory. The more the war was measured by traditional metrics, the more successful it appeared. The longer it continued, the more clearly those metrics proved irrelevant to the actual outcome. This created a crisis in military thought that persists. If superior forces, competently led, cannot achieve victory against an inferior enemy, what does victory mean? If body counts don't measure progress, what does? If controlling territory doesn't ensure success, what does success look like? These questions have been asked in every counterinsurgency since. They remain difficult to answer because they challenge the assumption that properly applied military force can solve any security problem. Vietnam proved that assumption false. What the military has struggled with ever since is accepting what that means for how wars should be fought, and whether some wars should be fought at all. The coast numbers tell part of the story. 58,000 American dead, 300,000 wounded, many of them carrying physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. 250,000 ARVN dead, an ally that fought longer and suffered more than American memory typically acknowledges. 950 enemy combatants dead by American estimates, many of them fighting for what they believed was independence from foreign domination. Between 600 and 2 million civilians dead, people caught in a war they didn't start and couldn't escape. $168 billion in direct costs, over $1 trillion in today's dollars, millions of tons of ordnance dropped, vast swaths of countryside cratered and defoliated. But numbers don't capture the real cost. The real cost is measured in what was broken: trust in government, confidence in military institutions, belief that American power could reshape the world. Through force of will, the real cost is measured in what was lost: a generation of young men, an ally abandoned, credibility that took decades to rebuild. The real cost is measured in what was learned and then forgotten, that cannot be destroyed. Through attrition, that legitimacy cannot be created through Firepower, that some objectives are not achievable at acceptable cost. These lessons were written in blood. And then, in Afghanistan, written again, the question remains in 2001. With the ruins of the World Trade Center still smoldering, the United States entered Afghanistan with overwhelming force and limited objectives. Find and destroy Al-Qaeda, remove the Taliban from power, prevent future attacks. Mission accomplished within months. The war continued for 20 years. Why? Because the objectives expanded, because limited aims became nation-building, because tactical success created the illusion of progress towards strategic goals that were never clearly defined, because the institutional memory of Vietnam proved insufficient to prevent repetition. The tactics were different. The technology was revolutionary. The force ratio was more favorable. The strategic logic was identical. Apply military force to create political outcomes. Measure progress through quantifiable metrics. Assume that sufficient pressure will break enemy will. And once again, tactical. Victories accumulated without producing strategic success. Once again, body counts proved meaningless. Once again, the enemies will outlasted American patience. Vietnam taught that some wars cannot be won through military excellence alone. Afghanistan proved the lesson wasn't learned. The question now is whether it ever will be. Because the next war, wherever it occurs, whenever it starts, will present the same fundamental challenge, matching military means to political ends, understanding enemy victory conditions, recognizing when force cannot achieve the desired objective. These are strategic questions. They require strategic answers. Vietnam demonstrated the cost of getting them wrong. The names on the wall in Washington are the receipt. 58,320 people who fought with courage and competence in a war that could not be won. That is the lesson. That is what victory means when the meaning breaks, the silence. Returns April 30, 1975. Saigon. The last helicopter lifts off from the American embassy rooftop. Below, crowds press against the gates. People who worked with the Americans believed in the Americans, trusted American promises. Most of them will not get out. The helicopter banks over the city. Saigon stretches below the wide boulevards, the crowded markets, the river winding through the delta. From this altitude, it looks peaceful. On the ground, NVA tanks are entering the city. By evening, the war will be over. The helicopter turns toward the sea, toward the carrier group waiting offshore, toward home. The war that broke the meaning of victory ends the way it began, quietly, with a small group of people leaving a situation they could not control. The difference is that 10 years earlier, the Americans believed they could win. Now they know better. That knowledge cost 58,000 lives. The question is what that knowledge is worth, whether the lesson it teaches will be remembered, or whether, in the fullness of time, it will be forgotten. And the same mistakes, dressed in different uniforms and fighting different enemies, will be repeated. Because the hardest lesson to learn is the simplest. Some wars cannot be won. Some victories do not exist. Asterisk, and knowing the difference requires wisdom that body counts cannot measure.